So I know I said I would do a full Call of Duty multiplayer review. Well, to be honest with you, I didn't want to play it anymore. I was getting angry, and not in the good synthetic man kind of angry review sort of way. No, I just got sick of it. So instead, let's talk about two games I actually like. Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. And yes, I know it is still pretty controversial even to this day to say that any of the 3D Sonic games are the best Sonic games. And look, I don't have a single problem with the 2D Sonics. I just don't think they're anything special. I've never been a huge fan of them. They're fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with them, except some of the later levels really do get a bit too slow-paced. There's too much actual platforming involved and not enough running fast. But still, definitely good games, some of the most legendary of all time for a reason. They get a bit of a free pass. Now, when it comes to Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, these are both deeply flawed games. I am not delusional or autistic by any stretch. Okay, maybe I'm a little autistic, but I can be highly critical of things I enjoy and have been many times in the past. That said, seeing as Sonic Frontiers is about to come out, I do want to pay a tribute to a time where people actually enjoyed the 3D Sonic games, even though it was a pretty short period of time. The Dreamcast Sonic games are still considered to be the best, and for good reason, and so let's talk about why. But before I get into this, do the things the algorithm likes. I really appreciate it, especially for these retrospective type videos that never seem to do that well. And maybe it'll encourage me to make more positive reviews in the future. They seem to be pretty rare on the channel these days. And so without further ado, let's channel our inner Chris-chan, well, before his mom, and run real fast. Now, the interesting thing about Sonic Adventure is that you actually play as 6 different characters across the course of the story, each being told by their individual perspective. And once you pick that character's story, you play as that character for the entire run of the game. This contrasts heavily from Sonic Adventure 2, which obviously we'll get to when we get to that game. But the best part about this is, pretty much everyone's going to pick Sonic first, and Sonic has the best story. It's roughly 5 hours of running really fast and getting used to the game's somewhat slippery controls, but ultimately it's fast as fuck, and in some ways actually controls better than any following 3D Sonic game. Mainly because of one specific mechanic, that being the spin dash combined with jumping. If you jump quickly enough after spin dashing, you maintain all of your momentum, allowing you to skip a lot of platforming sections and really up that speedrun factor to it. This is also the game that introduced the homing attack, and unfortunately, it's probably also the buggiest implementation of the homing attack. As many occasions, Sonic will circle around a target, hit nothing, and then you'll get hit and lose all your rings, which is obviously incredibly annoying. This is also the first implementation of the light speed dash, which, unfortunately, for whatever reason you have to charge up to use. I can sort of forgive this, again, for them just coming up with the concept and implementing it in this game, but it just kind of seems like common sense to have it just be a one-button press that lets you follow rings, right? Like every other game. And honestly, even just running forward, I kind of feel mixed about. I'd say the increase in momentum and speed feels pretty much perfect, but the actual controls sometimes feel great, sometimes feel horrible. And you honestly could say this about any 3D Sonic game. I almost feel like they need a sensitivity slider for your left analog stick just for running, because turning either feels incredibly slow and gradual or way too much, and then again you kill all the momentum. It doesn't help that a lot of these tracks you run on, for lack of a better term, are automated sequences, so you might think you're actually controlling it with the analog stick, but you're not. But honestly, if you've played any 3D Sonic game, you're already used to all this, so it's really not a problem. I may have not played all these games, but I've played more than enough to know how they control, so I'll admit, despite all these little nitpicks I'm making, I actually had very little issue controlling Sonic. It felt great despite this game being so old. And that's not to mention the stages themselves, which are actually pretty damn great. There's 10 speed stages, and I'd say 9 out of 10 are great. The only one I didn't really like so much is the casino, just because playing pinball isn't exactly my idea of fun, especially from a Sonic game. But if you lose all your lives and have less than 100 coins, you drop into the sewer, and the sewer has more than enough rings to help you beat the level, so I wouldn't say any of the levels are bad. They're all pretty good. And some of them have some really cool set pieces. One of them has you run inside a tornado. There's a snowboarding section where you outrun an avalanche. Another one has you navigating the underbelly and dodging cannons on the egg carrier. And near the end of the level, the entire thing flips sideways, which is really cool. And you can actually skip that entire sequence if you get through it fast enough. It's stuff like that I really appreciate from the level design, especially when you go back to replay the missions. That said, this era of Sonic, again being an early 3D game, does have some major issues, the biggest of which being the fucking camera. God damn is the camera terrible in this fucking game. The amount of times that it clipped into the wall are fucking countless, dude, and it killed me several times. But again, this is just kind of a quirk of early 3D, and I'm sure it was exacerbated by running so goddamn fast that the camera can't keep up with you. But it doesn't matter if you have the auto camera or the manual camera, it's still gonna get stuck in walls. Either way, it sucks. And this might not matter to a lot of people, but the UI is really fucking ugly in this game. It looks like some shit made in MS Paint and Movie Maker. And I know I've gone on record many times to say I don't care about graphics, because I really don't care about graphics that much, but there is a certain point where it just becomes distracting. Oh, and of course, I can't forget to mention the cutscenes that feel like machinimas from 2006.
Well, that wasn't so hard.
Aha!
Oh no!
I mean, holy hell, man, there is no sense of pacing here. It just feels like dragging people around in Gmod or some shit. I don't understand how anyone looked at this and thought this was okay. And I'm sure somebody in the comments is going to tell me this game was rushed in development or something, or they just didn't have enough budget, because Sonic Team never has enough budget or talent to make any game good, so it's a miracle that they've made as many decent games as they have. But it really doesn't excuse it at the end of the day, especially since they released a director's cut version and very few things were actually improved. In fact, the PC port of the director's cut is buggy as shit. I had to install a bunch of mods to fix things like the lighting and certain input bugs, and of course crashing, though ironically the Dreamcast conversion mod added more crashing to the game, at least for me. But it seems like the consensus among the fans is that the director's cut was a downgrade in a lot of ways, and the PC port is an even shittier version of that, so I'd recommend installing some mods. So what about the story itself? Well, this is a fucking Sonic game, so there's not really much to it. There's an evil water god creature called Chaos, who apparently is a mutated Chao, as you find out later, and Eggman is using him as a tool to destroy Station Square so he can build Eggmanopolis or whatever. And with each Chaos Emerald that Chaos obtains, he becomes more powerful. So Sonic has to defeat Eggman and Chaos, and along the way we get short snippets of Chaos's backstory, and we meet Tikal, an ancient echidna that was part of a warrior race of echidnas or something that ended up getting wiped out by Chaos. And so Tikal had to seal Chaos away and herself inside of the Master Emerald. Playing just Sonic's story will give you about 90% of this, which kind of makes you question why there's 5 other playable characters, which I might as well get into now because every single one of them is worse than playing as Sonic. So then naturally you're probably going to play as Tails, and Tails is actually not bad. My biggest problem with him is that all of his levels are just shortened versions of Sonic's levels, and he only has 5 out of the 10, with the specific gimmick of Tails being one that he can fly for short periods of time, which actually feels pretty damn good. It's fast, you can use shortcuts, and you have a bit of a glide afterward too, so you don't just crash into the ground. If there's one huge compliment I can give this game, it's that pretty much all the characters control well except for Big and Amy, who are fucking horrible. But the other 4 characters are great, so good job, Sonic Team. And the gimmick of Tails missions is that you're racing Sonic to the end. Yeah, that's it. Every stage is like 2 minutes long tops, so really it's not that bad. You're done with the story in about an hour. And the whole thing reads like Tails' headcanon of the events of the game, because you just replace all the scenes where Sonic saved the day with Tails saving the day. And then at the end, instead of taking out this huge Eggman dragon robot thing, he instead fires a missile into Station Square, which is a dud. And then Tails has to race him to the missile, disarms it, and then takes out a different Eggman robot. You can't fucking convince me this actually happened. Tails has fucking Luigi syndrome, and he just made this shit up in his head. Then we have Knuckles, which, if you've played Sonic Adventure 2, you're already going to be familiar with this gameplay style, as the Master Emerald has been destroyed, and he needs to find all the shards. And so Knuckles travels to 5 extremely shortened versions of Sonic's levels, now being just one big room that you have to search for the 3 emerald pieces. Now the good news is, each shard has an individual radar, so you can track multiple ones at the same time and get them in any order. Remember this for later. Knuckles can glide and climb walls, making it much easier to navigate these huge vertical rooms. And so finding all 3 is pretty easy. This is another character that finishes their stages in about 2 to 3 minutes. And so even with cutscenes, Knuckles' story was less than an hour long, and really, his involvement in the plot is almost completely irrelevant. He gets to fight a unique form of chaos that no other character does, which, to briefly talk about the bosses, they're all fucking horrible and incredibly easy, especially when you fight other characters. You can literally beat them in under 10 seconds.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no.
So I don't even know why they bothered having as many bosses as they did, seeing as maybe a third of them felt like they had any amount of effort put into them. But at least they're not annoying or buggy as shit, unlike several that probably came to your mind as soon as I mentioned that from later games. But ultimately, I'd say 80% of the bosses are completely pointless and should be cut from the game. The only other part of Knuckles' story that's kind of interesting is he gets a few flashbacks to Tikal's stuff, and they modeled this huge Echidna Mayan temple area, but there's pretty much nothing in it. You can get an upgrade for one of the characters, but I think that's about it. I'm not really sure why they put development time into this for a bunch of worthless NPCs that you talk to for like 1 second. Which actually brings me to another tangent I actually haven't talked about, the adventure field, which is one of the unique elements of this game. As Sonic Adventure has a mini sandbox, it's pretty bare bones though. There are some hidden emblems and you can get some special Chao eggs. But for the most part, it's tiny little rooms that connect the levels and give you some context for story in between the levels. And the only part of it that feels like wasted space is the Mystic Ruins, which there really are just kind of empty fields there, and a jungle maze that really just doesn't add anything to the game except frustration in a couple of the characters' stories, as I had no idea where to look for one of the fucking idols. You already know what I'm talking about. I think I wasted at least 15 minutes looking for that shit. But honestly, I don't really have a single problem with it. I think it adds a little bit of a unique flavor to this game, and I'm actually pretty sad that none of the subsequent games innovated on this at all, instead just cutting out the adventure field concept. Now that Sonic Frontiers is actually going to have a full open world, it's going to have all the things I hate about giant empty open worlds, whereas Station Square and Mystic Ruins were compact and had just enough content to justify their size, which is extremely lacking in modern games. So anyway, now we get to Amy, which this is where the game starts to go to shit. Amy only has 3 stages, so you'd think that you just knock out this story and move to the next one and it's not a big deal, but holy hell, it fucking sucks. Amy is not just half as fast as Sonic, she's like a quarter as fast as Sonic. She's so goddamn slow. And the only mechanic she has is that when you're running at full speed, if you swing your hammer, she can do a high jump flip. Which is better than nothing and actually does feel good to use, but again, you have to be running at max speed. If you're running at slightly less than max speed, then she just swings her hammer on the ground, which you're forced to stand still during, which is a problem because the gimmick of her stages is that she's constantly running away from a robot, which if it grabs you, kills you. so you obviously want to be constantly running at full speed, but I really can't emphasize enough how slow she is, and her normal jump is really low. Her story is also completely fucking pointless. It's basically an addendum on Gamma's story, which is much better. If you played the game, you know why, and we'll get to that in a second. So I have to ask, why the hell do you even play as Amy to begin with, if they weren't even going to make her fun to play? The only good thing I can say about her is that she does have a unique level that Sonic doesn't ever play, that being Hot Shelter. But guess what? It's the worst goddamn level in the game. At least for Amy. Gamma's version is okay. So let's move on to Big the Cat, which is obviously the worst. Even if you've never played this game, I bet you already know his story is just one big fishing mini-game. Basically an advertisement for Sega Bass Fishing, or whatever the fuck it's called. And yeah, it's fucking horrible. I don't even hate fishing mini-games, but this one is horrendous, dude. Now, if you're only playing this to complete his story and don't care about any of the emblems, meaning you're only trying to catch Froggy in each mission, it's not so bad because Froggy's probably the easiest fish to catch. Well, he's not a fish, he's a frog, but you get the point. But if you're trying to fucking 100% this game, this is the most infuriating fishing I've ever played in a game. I don't want to explain this in detail, because despite the fact that it's very simple controls-wise, it's more complex than you think. The short version is, you can reel in slow, or you can reel in fast. Reeling in fast obviously will break your line a lot faster than slowly, but the closer the fish gets to you, the more pressure it puts on your fishing line. And the fish will pull away from you periodically, and there's nothing you can do except just watch this animation happen. Holy fuck, I hate it. Anyway, Big the Cat's relevance to the plot is that Froggy swallowed a piece of chaos and also one of the Master Emeralds. And that's it, that's the whole relevance. At the very end of the story, you actually get a boss battle, except the entire boss is you just fish Froggy out of chaos. If you know what you're doing, you could beat this in like 10 seconds, just like any of the character fights. So then we get to the final character, Gamma, and luckily the game actually becomes decent again. If you've played Sonic Adventure 2, this is just like all the shooting segments. It's exactly where they got that gameplay style from. But much like the Knuckles levels, Gamma's levels are actually a little bit better than the Adventure 2 shooty levels. Mostly because 3 out of 4 of them are shorter than the Adventure 2 levels. And I also just think the levels are better designed too. There's a lot less platforming. I have no fucking clue why they wanted to put platforming in mech suits in the sequel. And so all you do is hold square to acquire targets and let go, and you shoot all the targets you locked onto, and it increases your timer as you now have a time limit. And that's pretty much it. It doesn't really get any more complex than that gameplay-wise. It's fine. The ones in Adventure 2 are definitely worse. I'm not even going to wait till we get to that section to say it. Now, as for the story, as this is the part everyone actually likes about playing as Gamma. So you're actually playing as an Eggman robot who gains some amount of sentience. And so the first couple missions you're serving under Eggman, trying to find Froggy, and also capturing a bird that escaped into Amy's clutches. And once you complete the latter, Amy tries convincing Gamma to be a good guy and let her free, but only when he recognizes the bird that she's holding does he let her go. As we find out later, the robot powering Gamma is that bird's friend. And so Gamma decides that all the other E100 series units need to die so he can free the animal trapped inside, as this was still when Eggman was using animals to power his robots to connect to the older games. So the next 3 levels involve you tracking down the other robots, 2 out of 3 being the shittiest boss fights in the entire game, and the final one basically being a gimmick where you just shoot a bunch of pipes around him. And so the only robots left are Gamma himself and Beta, one that you fight in the beginning, and who was secretly modifying himself to make himself more powerful, as apparently he also had sentience, but chose to be a bad guy. So before the final boss battle, Gamma has a moment where he realizes he will have to terminate himself to free the final bird.
Units remaining. Gamma.
Luckily, it doesn't come to that. After engaging with one of the only decent boss fights in the game, Gamma destroys Beta, but as he's about to blow up, he gets a cheap shot in, which also lethally damages Gamma, and so the story ends with the birds inside the two of them reuniting, and you have to play through Amy's story to get the true ending here as the three finally meet up again. Since I never actually owned this game growing up, I only played it at friends' houses, this is my first time finishing the game. So being a dude in his 20s, I really didn't feel anything here. The story is very low budget and sloppily handled. The cutscenes are horrible, as I already mentioned. But I guarantee you if I played this as a kid, I would have teared up at this scene for sure. I loved Iron Giant growing up, and any robot self-sacrifice stories where they become human, that gets me. So I see what they were going for. It's definitely still the best story in this game, so I will give it credit where it's due. So now that you've completed the 6 character stories, it's time to have your final sequence as Super Sonic. After watching a series of cutscenes and traveling around the open world for no real reason, Chaos somehow gets a hold of the 7 Chaos Emeralds. It's fucking dumb how it happens, so I'm not even going to cover it. And so now he's become Perfect Chaos, this giant sea monster that actually floods and destroys Station Square. So I guess Eggman won in the end. And so the only hope for the heroes is to absorb the positive energy from the Chaos Emeralds so Sonic can become Super Sonic. So yes, the power of friendship saves the day. And the final boss battle just involves flying in a straight line while collecting rings and making sure you collide with Chaos fast enough to be able to hit him in the head. If he hits you at any time, it doesn't make you lose your rings, but it does slow you down enough that you're going to have to run through the track again. And during this entire sequence, the opening theme, Open Your Heart, is playing, which, despite the name, is actually a really good song. I'm a big fan of Crush 40's work, partially because, well, I grew up with a lot of the tracks, and while it's definitely not my favorite, it's really solid, makes this whole thing feel a lot more epic than it actually is, and ultimately I'd say the final boss battle is just fine. It's not great, but it's not terrible either. The controls do get in the way slightly, but it's not nearly as bad as the other final boss that we're going to get into in this video. Personally, if it was up to me, I would make the final boss actually use skills that you acquired over the course of the game, you know, just to have like a normal Sonic level and mechanics, but at least this whole thing makes for a pretty cool set piece. To briefly talk about extra content before we move on to Adventure 2, if you want to 100% this game, you got a shit ton of stuff to do. You have to complete the B mission and A mission for all of the characters, which basically means fulfilling a specific objective while completing the level again, that usually being collect 50 rings and then beating it under a certain time limit. And then, of course, there's a bunch of emblems hidden in the world. There's a few mini-games that aren't really worth mentioning that you also have to complete certain things in. And then, of course, you have the Chao Garden, which I'm specifically not going to talk about here because Adventure 2's is better in every single way. So ultimately, I'd say Sonic Adventure 1 is a great game, but deeply flawed. Playing as Sonic is probably some of the most fun I've ever had playing a Sonic game because you just play Sonic stages in 3D and the stages themselves are fairly well designed. Not too linear, not too complicated platforming that constantly slows you down. It's just good enough and it's of a consistent quality all the way through. The rest of the game ranges from okay to actual shit. So what about Sonic Adventure 2, the game I grew up playing and played like probably 10 fucking times? Well, obviously I have rose-tinted glasses for it a bit, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to acknowledge its flaws. First, let's begin with the main gameplay changes. The first thing you're going to notice is that there's no more adventure field. It is a straightforward linear story. You go from mission to mission, swapping between the 3 gameplay styles, that being the speed stages with Sonic and Shadow, treasure hunting stages with Knuckles and Rouge, and the mech stages with Tails and Eggman. Now you'll probably notice immediately that all 3 of these gameplay styles already existed in Adventure 1, and now they've been expanded to all be roughly a third of the story each, which is probably the biggest criticism of this game and the most fair by far. Because if you hate the treasure hunting stages or the shooting stages, that is a huge chunk of this game you're not going to like flat out. And I am one of those people who fucking hates the shooting stages. They're so goddamn boring. So now we've got 33% of the game that is automatically bad, at least by my own metric. As for the loss of the adventure field, it's not that big of a deal, but I really would have preferred that they expanded on the concept. Not to the point of making a sandbox or open world, of course. If you know my channel, you know I don't like those games, usually. But it's one of many examples of Sonic Team completely cutting a feature instead of expanding and improving on it. So let's talk about the speed stages first, as they are obviously the best part of the game by far. And I'd say they are mostly good. The last stage, as Sonic and Shadow both suck, Sonic's especially Final Rush is probably the most frustrating level I've ever played in a 3D Sonic game. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here because the first Sonic stage is actually the best 3D Sonic stage ever made, at least in my opinion. City Escape is fucking fantastic. It is everything I've ever wanted out of a Sonic level. I've played it probably 100 fucking times. I don't even know where to begin with it. It's great in every single way. It starts off with a snowboarding sequence, sort of. You're surfing down the middle of the street, crashing into cars and knocking them down this never-ending San Francisco-style hill, and you jump off ramps and do fucking flips and get upgrades and shit. Meanwhile, the greatest Sonic theme ever is playing, Escape from the City. And once you finally gain control of Sonic on the ground, it's just constant momentum, chain homing attacks between enemies, using the light speed dash once you unlock it in a later level, running down another street and jumping off more ramps, spin dashing up hills, and I haven't even mentioned at the end of the level the fucking huge gun truck that is the size of the entire street. If I did have to complain about something, it's the grinding controls, because yeah, they added rail grinding in this one, and obviously they didn't test it that well. There is no reliable way to swap between rails, whether they're in front of you or right next to you. You're supposed to be able to swap rails if they're close enough together, but it rarely works. And in the case of City Escape, you need to jump between them when they're in front of you, which normally would be fine if the camera was directed behind you, but often the camera's at an angle, so the only way to reliably jump to the next rail is to let go of the analog stick, which is not intuitive in the least. Eventually you get used to it as you play the stage over and over again to master it, and once you have that perfect flow down, it's fucking sweet. The other speed stages aren't quite as good because it seems like the later you get into the game, they either become more complex or more scripted, which is kind of a problem. Sonic Adventure 1's 3D stages still had a certain openness to them. Half the time there was a secondary path that would take you to the same destination, and the paths themselves were just literally wider. There was more space for you to go left or right. Adventure 2 is not quite like this. I think the perfect example of a linear stage is Metal Harbor, where it might as well just be a fucking straight line. There's very little deviation, very little use of creativity, and while I don't think the controls have changed enough between games to really dedicate a section to them, the loss of the spin dash jump, whatever it's really called, maybe there's a name for it, but you get what I mean. I explained it earlier. That's no longer in Adventure 2. In fact, spin dashing actually requires you to stand still and hold the button down for a couple seconds just to start it, so it's almost never even worth using, which I hate to say it, but it's undoubtedly a bad thing, giving you less player freedom, less ability to break the game or be creative with it is almost always a bad thing. That being said, I still enjoy these stages. Metal Harbor is still fun as fuck. Green Forest is great. When you eventually get to play as Shadow, Radical Highway and Skyrail are both really solid stages. It's only when you get to the end, it becomes annoying as fuck. I don't want to dedicate a whole part of this video to ranting about Final Rush, but I definitely could. The short version is, all of a sudden the game wants you to master rail grinding without giving you any extensive tutorial in how it works. You have death surrounding you at all times. I mean, you can very easily fall off the cliff and die here because there's almost no safe zones here. And the amount of times that you're expected to navigate through the air with the, let's be honest, slippery controls it's gonna lead to you dying many fucking times.
Yeah!
And when I game overed and actually beat the entire level without dying, what did I get rewarded with? A D rank. I'll talk about ranks at the end, but let's just say that added insult to injury. I'd still say the stage selection is really solid, definitely not consistently as good as Adventure 1, but the first few stages as both Sonic and Shadow are really fun. Unfortunately, it's all downhill from here. Now let's get to the treasure hunting stages. If you've played Sonic Adventure 1, it's very similar except with one major downgrade. That being, you can only track one emerald shard at a time. So you have to collect each of the 3 in order unless you get really lucky and end up spying one on your way to search for one of the other 2. I have no idea why Sonic Team would have such a massive downgrade to this gameplay style and compared to the first, except the obvious one being they want to pad out these levels. Like I already said earlier in the video, you could complete those older missions in less than 1 minute. In fact, that was one of the challenges the A rank won. That is almost impossible in Sonic Adventure 2 given what I just said, and the fact that the levels are now twice as large, if not more, in the case of Meteor Herd and Mad Space. The latter being the most annoying by far. That being said, I don't hate these stages at all. I actually really like exploring around the levels, looking for this stuff, because I'm a big fan of collect-a-thon platformers. I've said it before. Spyro is my favorite game of all time, and so exploring in these little zones is kind of like that style of gameplay. Yes, it's a lot slower than the Sonic gameplay, but it can still be fun. I liked most of the treasure hunt stages, just not those last 2. Or Aquatic Mine, at least until you get the air necklace there. Which I guess I could briefly bring up the upgrades. There were upgrades in the first game as well, but most of them were completely inconsequential. In the second game, some of them are incredibly necessary upgrades, usually being destroying a metal box, or in the case of the one I just mentioned, allows you to breathe underwater. Sonic gets the bounce bracelet, which is actually a neat little additional mechanic that he can use to bounce up and down to go higher. And most of Tails and Eggman's upgrades are pretty much the same as Gamma's in Adventure 1, just upgrades for shooting stuff. So speaking of Tails, now we get to the final gameplay style. These shooting missions. They're fucking horrible. They might as well be on rails. Except in some ways they're worse than on rails because there's a bunch of platforming. I didn't cover it too much in detail when I was talking about Adventure 1, but Gamma stages were essentially just shortened Sonic stages, and Gamma controlled like a slower Sonic, so it was completely fine. These mechs control like absolute shit. They have borderline tank controls in the sense that if you're not running straight forward, they lose all momentum and are very, very slow. And the gameplay just consists of holding square to target as many enemies as possible and letting go. That's it. That's how you get an A rank on these stages. Rack up as high a combo of targets as possible to get bonus points, and try not to get hit. The best thing I can say is at least you have a proper health bar instead of the shitty Sonic health system that's in most of these games. And I really wish there was more to talk about with these Eggman and Tails stages, but there really isn't anything else to them. As they progress, they get marginally more difficult, but really they just throw more enemies at you, and the levels are ridiculously fucking long. One of them took me 9.5 minutes. Sure, I got 0 time bonus, but that was me trying to rack up as many points as possible. Obviously, I went a little bit too slow. But that shouldn't even be possible unless I'm standing still. So what about the boss fights? They're a bit better than Adventure 1, but that's not really saying much. They're still pretty easy, all things considered, but at least they feel like legitimate boss fights, and a lot of them can be shortened depending on how risky you're willing to be trying to hit them. Specifically, the character boss battles are more complex, whereas they were completely brain dead in the previous one. Now they have a gimmick to them. Most of the gimmicks suck, And in the case of the second Eggman vs. Tails fight, it's just complete fucking bullshit. They get their multiplayer super moves and you don't. And one of them is a laser that covers half the fucking screen. But I still would say this is ultimately a step up from the previous game. At least they're holding my attention. So I've avoided talking about it until now because it really doesn't matter all that much, but the game is divided into the hero side story and dark side story, which basically just means you play as the 3 good guys in one and 3 bad guys in the other. Without a doubt, the hero side story is better because the dark side story starts off with you playing as Eggman, and there's actually only 4 shadow stages in the game. And as you might expect, the story is divided between the two. The story is another element I don't really want to talk about because it really sucks. And my rose-tinted glasses are slowly cracking as I'm thinking about it. It's really dumb. Adventure 1's was simple, kinda goofy, lighthearted, it definitely fit the overall tone that you would expect. Adventure 2 is a bit more serious, while also being really poorly written and stupid. So I'll just sum it up really briefly. Basically, at some point, humanity built a huge space station called the Space Colony Ark, which also had secret experiments. And these experiments were conducted by Dr. Gerald Robotnik, aka Eggman's grandfather, and he created the ultimate life form, which is a fucking hedgehog. A black and red, edgy hedgehog.
I'm the coolest.
And I guess the experiments were inhumane or fucked up in some way, so the government shut it down, killed Maria, which is Gerald's granddaughter, and so he went crazy and wanted to genocide the entire human population. Yes, this is a real plot from a Sonic game. Shadow was sent down to Earth and I guess was captured by Gun, the military arm of this world government, and was locked up in a secret facility until now, where Eggman breaks him out and all his memories are fucked up, which is a constant theme of Shadow across the next 3 games. And Eggman, as usual, just wants to conquer the world. And so him and Shadow team up. Shadow tells him about the space colony. And meanwhile, the government is looking for this mysterious hedgehog that's breaking out of jail and somehow confuse Sonic for Shadow. One is black and red, the other one is blue. This makes no fucking sense. But somehow it gets worse. So while all this is happening, Rouge the Bat, who is a treasure hunter, tries to get the Master Emerald. Knuckles destroys it so she can't get it. And the two of them basically spend 90% of the story finding the Emerald Shards. Knuckles has very, very little relevance to the overall plot. It also turns out Rouge is a secret government agent, which really doesn't matter at all to the plot. It's a meaningless twist. But she teams up with Eggman and Shadow, and they go to the Space Colony Ark and figure out that you need 7 Chaos Emeralds to power the super death laser that can blow up a planet. Why is there a planet buster laser in Sonic? Meanwhile, the good guys have the last Chaos Emerald, as Tails was awarded it for saving Station Square. Is this supposed to be a retcon because Station Square was destroyed by Perfect Chaos? You can't tell me that that giant fucking biblical flood was cleaned up and the city was rebuilt fine. Whatever, I'm obviously putting way too much thought into fucking Sonic. So the good guys team up to find Eggman's secret pyramid base, which has a shuttle that can take them to the Space Colony Ark. During this whole thing, Shadow is having memories of the past and Maria being gunned down, except he conveniently doesn't remember Maria's final message to him. And so it's sort of implied he also wants to kill the humans, or he's just an edgelord, that's it.
How pathetic.
So now that the heroes and villains are on the Space Colony Ark, it's a race to get the Master Emerald together to neutralize the Chaos Emeralds so that Eggman can't threaten the planet with his Planet Buster laser. And of course, at the end, the good guys win. But that's not the end of the story. Once you've completed both the hero and dark side, you unlock the last story. Now, I'm sure fans of this game are going to notice I skipped over a lot of plot elements, especially from the hero side story, but really, you're not missing anything important outside of a goofy scene where Sonic and Tails talk to the fucking president.
Your country will cease to exist. You have 24 hours to give me your answer.
No way!
What the?
Sonic,
Eggman Empire. Yeah, right.
What the heck's going on here?
And Chaos Control as a plot device, which at first you would think exists to make Shadow look really cool, but it turns out it actually exists to make Sonic look even more cooler, as he's able to use it in a tiny pod being shot into space with a fake Chaos Emerald that is not as powerful as a normal one. But again, nobody gives a shit about Sonic's story, so I'm just bitching about nothing as usual. I do want to say that at least the cutscenes and overall presentation are somewhat better than Adventure 1, at least there's a lot more actual animation, but the sound mixing is beyond horrible. Anybody who's played this game can't hear shit. If there wasn't subtitles, you wouldn't be able to understand half of what the characters say. And for some reason, characters interrupt each other, most notably before the first Sonic and Shadow boss fight.
Faker, I think you're the fake hedgehog around here. You're comparing yourself to me? Ha! You're not even good enough to be
I'll
my
make you
fake.
eat those words.
So back to the last story. As Eggman tries to fire the laser, it obviously fails because Sonic and his friends succeeded, but apparently Dr. Gerald Robotnik had a backup plan. I guess just in case the planet-busting laser got shut down, the space colony Ark would be sent out of orbit and would crash into Earth, killing everybody. So to stop this, the gang has to journey to the core of the machine, and you have to play as 5 out of 6 of the characters, the missing character being Shadow, so the level kinda sucks for obvious reasons. Weirdly enough, it's actually easier than the final level as any of the other characters. Meanwhile, Amy convinces Shadow to save all the people on Earth, and Shadow has a flashback to Maria's final message that she actually wanted him to fight for humanity.
For all people who live on that planet, give them a chance to be happy.
And so he quickly makes his way to the core, and then we get to the final boss being the Bio Lizard, a prototype for the ultimate life form. And both forms of this boss are definitely the most annoying boss battles in the game. You can tell Sonic Team was rushing to complete it at this point, as this boss fight is just plain buggy and annoying. And look, I've played this game a bunch of times, so I know how it works, so it doesn't seem like I'm fucking up in this gameplay footage here, because I know the shitty quirks of this fight, but the first time you go into this, you're gonna die from bullshit over and over again. Whether it's slipping into the little river gaps in the platforms as you're running away from him, or not figuring out you need to do a somersault to go under these shadow ball things that he shoots out of his mouth, or the homing attack fucking up, which the homing attack in this game is much more reliable than the first, but it still fucks up more than enough times, trust me. And for some reason, in the final boss fight, when you need it to work, it fucks up more times than anywhere else in the game. Eventually, you take this thing down, but it teleports onto the planet-destroying laser, and so Sonic and Shadow have to go supersonic, which they don't need the power of friendship to do, and Shadow just kind of knows how to do it, I guess. And so it's time for the final boss battle, which obviously reflects the previous game, but is way shittier, trust me. And the way this boss fight is supposed to work is you navigate to these glowy pustules on the Bio Lizard, and you hit them by pressing square X. What the game doesn't tell you is you can just hold square X to move faster and continue the attack forever. Meanwhile, your rings are depleting, just like the first game, and if they go to 0, you lose. And if your timer reaches 5 minutes, you also lose. And every time you hit them, you swap between Sonic and Shadow, giving them time to replenish their ring count. Which none of this sounds that bad so far, except it's hard to describe, but it feels like you're moving through molasses the whole time. And there's no way to precisely control this air dash attack. You just hold square X, and they move at a 45-degree angle, and as the Bio Lizard loses health, more and more bullet hell style projectiles are on screen. It starts with a laser that follows you, then it's 2 lasers that follow you, then it's a minefield of the glowy orb things from the first form, and it's just a giant fucking pain in the ass. I couldn't believe that I beat him in one try for this video. I have never beaten him in one try before. I got extraordinarily lucky. The best thing I can say about it is Live and Learn is playing throughout the entire thing, the main theme of this game, and I fucking love that song. Probably my favorite Crush 40 song. Kind of a shitty finish to this decent game, but given the wild drops in quality all across the game, I guess it shouldn't be too surprising. And after the boss fight, Shadow runs out of rings and drops super form and crashes into the earth, dying. Well, no, he doesn't die. Of course he doesn't fucking die. Shadow's like the most popular character in Sonic. And guess what? The sequels just use this opportunity to gaslight the fuck out of him, but at least it's kind of a sad moment. All the characters are like, wow, Shadow sacrificed himself to save the world, instead of being a shmool schmooter or something.
There are too many of them. What are we going to do?
And before we get into the conclusion, I'll talk about the extra content. There is a shitty kart racing minigame that there's 2 missions of in the main story. It sucks, not really worth talking about. As for replaying the stages, this is where they stepped up from the previous game. There's 5 missions per stage now, and you have to get an A rank in every one to get all of the emblems. A rank is far more difficult than you'd ever think, given not only the previous game, but also a lot of the following 3D Sonic games. For example, in Sonic Generations, I S-ranked half the stages on the first try. In Adventure 2, it probably took me upwards of 30 tries, including using YouTube videos, to A-rank Metal Harbor. Part of that is due to the somewhat jank controls requiring you to make precise movements, which is always a recipe for disaster. And sometimes it just requires you having intimate knowledge of the level, like City Escape, which I don't have a single problem with. But for some of the late game stages, it is incredibly difficult. It's already hard enough to beat those levels without dying. Try beating them with over 100 rings and beating them under a certain time limit and making sure to get certain score bonuses by jumping from rail to rail or chain attacking a bunch of things. So let's finally talk about Chao Garden. This shit gets kind of complex, so if you want someone to really break it down in detail, this is not the video for it. But I will say, for many people, this is why we played this game so much. Because in every stage, when you destroy robots, you either get an animal, if it's an Eggman robot, or there's also hidden animals in each stage, or you get this little power vial thing, if it's a gun robot. And you give these to the Chaos to up their stats, and eventually, when their stats are high enough, you enter them either into a race or karate. Sounds pretty simple, but this very, very simple concept is also surprisingly addicting. There's just something fun about raising creatures, right? I mean, that's what's made Pokemon so successful for 25 years. So naturally, people get really attached to these cute little things. And the main improvements over the previous game, obviously the addition of Chao Karate being one of the main ones, but I'd say the more important one is that you can directly go from the levels to Chao Garden. Now, if you're using stage select, you can do it at any time, but if you're playing story mode, all you have to do is break one of these Chao boxes and you get a key and it takes you to the Chao Garden after the level. In Sonic Adventure 1, you actually had to navigate in the overworld to the Chao Garden, which is a giant fucking pain in the ass. So once you've raised your Chao stats high enough, it's time to enter them into the Chao race or karate. And this is where it becomes mostly automated, based on whatever their stats are in swimming, flying, running, power, and stamina. They will perform better in certain events in racing, whether that's obviously gliding across a gap, or swimming, or running, or climbing a wall. For Chao Karate, you're watching 2 Chao beat the shit out of each other. This is like watching a street fight between 2 toddlers. It is weirdly entertaining. And Chao Garden just adds a whole new level of replayability to this game on top of trying to get all these A ranks. It's crazy to me that they've never brought back Chao Garden again. That is so dumb. Everyone loved this, and I mean everyone. There's no way Sonic Team doesn't know that people want this back. I just don't think they care. And I almost forgot to mention there's actually a 2-player versus mode, and it's actually pretty good. A bit bare bones, but I remember having a lot of fun on the speed stages specifically, as it's exactly what you expect. You race to the end, and if you collect a certain amount of rings, you can freeze your opponent or attack them, and you can also compete to collect emerald shards and shoot each other in mechs, though they're not quite as fun. Definitely a pretty good addition. Too bad Sonic Team didn't think so and never fucking brought it back after this point. So, in conclusion, which is the better game, Sonic Adventure 1 or 2? I hate to fucking say it. I really hate to say it, but I think Adventure 1 is the better game, and I can't believe I didn't play it all the way through until now. It's just the more consistent experience, especially if someone's never played either one of these games. Sonic Adventure 1, you could just play the Sonic story and have a great time. With Adventure 2, there's no right way to play the game, except if you already have a file that's beaten the game and you use Stage Select to only play the speed stages. But even then, you're not even getting like a story there. There's no context for any of the stages, and I know most people don't give a fuck about story in Sonic. You still need some kind of context for what you're doing. Just dropping you into a level select is not the same thing. So that means most people are going to play the treasure hunt stages, which are a mixed bag to say the least, and the slow, boring, brain-dead shooting stages, which are just bad. Even if you prefer the level design of the speed stages in Adventure 2, that doesn't make up for all these shitty levels, it just doesn't. But in Adventure 2's defense, the first game's biggest problem is that you're replaying the same 10, or technically 11, stages over and over again, just tweaked or shortened for the other characters. Adventure 2 has a lot of up and downs, whereas Adventure 1 peaks early and then goes downhill from there. So it's still pretty close. So you'd think that given the general positive fan reception of these two games, that the next Sonic game would take the best of both worlds, and Adventure 3 would be an indisputably great game, right? Well, of course not. This is Sonic Team we're talking about. They never even made a direct sequel to the adventure games. All they did is experiment with weird concepts and mechanics, and in some ways it feels like their games only got lower and lower budget. Because even though Sonic Heroes, presentation-wise, is a step up in almost every way from the adventure games, gameplay-wise, it fucking sucks. And requires you to play the same game with slight variations 4 times. And what about Shadow the Hedgehog? It added fucking guns and made the controls complete shit, and you had to play the same game 10 times. With only a couple new levels, depending on if you pick the neutral hero or dark path. And then we got Sonic 06, one of the worst games ever made, and I'm happy to say I still haven't played to this day. And that's pretty much the end of the Adventure Saga. Then we got the Boost Saga, which we've still had to this day, with obviously some spin-offs, and then Sonic Boom happened, and that was horrible. So, as someone who's not exactly a 2D Sonic fan, Sonic has been basically dead to me for 15 years, if not more. Do I expect Sonic Frontiers to bring back Sonic into the limelight and make it a quality franchise again? Fuck no. I'm sure it's gonna be complete shit. Are you really gonna ask me that? Do you know what channel you clicked on? That said, I wanted to talk about 2 Sonic games I actually like. And I would recommend anybody who has even a passing interest in Sonic to try these games if they haven't already, but I feel like most Sonic fans have played these games. Not expecting anything from Frontiers. In fact, by the time this video comes out, I bet the game will be out. So there's no point in speculating. See you next time, guys, as I talk about potentially the next worst Sonic game.